For everyone. This week you have a PowerPoint presentation. This video gives you some basic tips and techniques to help you approach this assignment. First, in the week 4 lesson, there's some explanation that you will need to read through before you approach this assignment. For example, there are some poetic devices that the lesson explains that will help you with the presentation. Again, we're going to go back to the word theme. Theme means that the work has some sort of greater meaning besides its general interpretation. This holds true for short stories, and it definitely holds true for poems. When you read a poem, you will have to try to figure out the basic meaning of that poem, but in general, the poem has some sort of deeper meaning as well. For example, let's say you are discussing Frost's Mending Wall. Well, Mending Wall discusses a wall that is between a neighbor and the narrator, and they're working together to fix this wall. The neighbor says throughout the poem, good fences makes good neighbors. Now, the poem could be simply about building a wall, but as we can see when we think about the poem, it really is saying something about the universal idea of the walls between people, between countries, between neighbors in general, and how that separates people, but possibly helps to create relationships as well. That's what we mean by theme. We don't just mean the plot or the general interpretation of a poem. We are looking for some sort of deeper analysis with that poem. So keeping this idea of theme in mind, what we're discussing this week and what we're going to work on with our presentations is the idea of critical lenses. This is often also called critical theory. Now, I know this seems like a tricky concept, but basically think of it this way. You wear sunglasses, and the sunglasses can make what you see around you dark. Or let's say you have the quote unquote rose-colored glasses on. Well, then everything that you see kind of has a rosy shade, right? So think of critical lenses in this same way. Critical lenses are just a way for you to view a work in a different manner. And I really do want you to watch this video right here because this will help you understand what it is meant by critical lenses. However, just think of eyeglasses with different tints, and you're using these eyeglasses to give yourself a different interpretation of a work. One more point about critical lenses. Oftentimes, students say that the author is using a critical lens. For example, the author is using historical criticism, or the author is using feminist criticism. That's incorrect. The author is not using the critical lens or the critical theory. Instead, you, the interpreter, is using this lens to offer a unique look at a work. All right? So let's look at the first couple of critical lenses that we will discuss. First, new criticism is basically your general interpretation of a work. It's like what you did with the short story essay last week. You're trying to figure out a theme, you're using the vocabulary to discover an interpretation. It's generally how you use a typical interpretation of a work. It's a typical interpretation, basically. But then we have biographical criticism. Biographical criticism is a little bit different in that you're using the author's biography to arrive at an interpretation. So let's go back to Mending Wall again. So we kind of went into the basic interpretation of Mending Wall earlier, but let's say you were using Frost's past to arrive at a certain interpretation of the work. So maybe Frost had a stunted relationship with a friend and there was a wall between them, and he wrote about that in his poem, Mending Wall. I just made that up. I don't know if that's accurate. I'm thinking it isn't, but that's what I mean by biographical criticism. You take one part of an author's biography and you use that part to explain something about a poem or a short story or what have you. I've seen students, when they are thinking that they're writing about a poem using biographical criticism, and they interject the entire author's biography in their critical essay. This is incorrect. You only give the portions of the author's biography that create some sort of interpretation of the work. Remember, the work plays a starring role, not the author's biography. All right. Now, reader response criticism is tricky because you are writing about how a reader interacts with the text, this sort of relationship between the reader and the work, right? However, in academic work, you have to avoid first person. And it says it right here, no I, me, mine, we, us, and our. So you do have to still write in third person, but you are talking about this sort of interaction between the writer and the actual work. It's a tricky one. So in actuality, I would advise you, if you do want to use reader response for the assignment this week and for future assignments, to really take a look at this particular video, because it does give you some great information about what it means to use reader response criticism. Again, that critical lens that you're putting on to interpret the work would be what you're doing with reader response criticism. All right, so now let's look at feminist criticism. All right, now you're looking at a work using a feminist angle, but it also could mean you're looking at a work through the angle from a male as well. So sometimes we call it feminist criticism, but oftentimes we call it gender criticism. And although this video is discussing feminist criticism, really he's talking about issues facing gender and how that's emphasized in literary works. So let's go back to Mending Wall again. All right, so there is the narrator and then there is the neighbor, right? And we can make an argument that the narrator is male, but really we don't know, even though the writer is Frost, but the narrator could be male, female, what have you. The neighbor, though, is obviously male. And so now this relationship could be issues that face male relationships in terms of friendship. You know, they never can get too close because there's a wall between the two. Or it could be a male-female relationship where the female wants to really understand the neighbor and really get to know him, but there's a wall between them because of the male role that the neighbor has. Again, I just made that up. I don't know if it's accurate or not. You probably would have to look at the text a little bit closely, but that sort of interpretation would mean that you're using feminist criticism or the critical lens through feminism to interpret a work. All right, so let's go to the next one. All right, so now we've got Marxist and social criticism, and this one seems to be tricky as well, because sometimes students see the word Marxism and they're thinking to themselves, oh, Marxist, but that's not really what it is. Basically, it's focused on class and class conflict. All right, so you would use the critical lens, think of those glasses again, right? And you're using the lens to look at a work and think about and interpret the work, thinking about how it addresses class issues. So let's think about Mending Wall again. It's this one is a little tricky, but I can come up with something. And so here's what I'm thinking with Mending Wall and Marxist criticism. Okay, so the neighbor could be someone who's always done the old way of doing things. He's a regular farmer and he's always farmed this way. He's always made the wall this way. But then, the narrator who's kind of, new wealth maybe, or kind of a hipster maybe, wants to change this old farming manner because he's owning the farm not for money, but for fun. right? And so he doesn't understand the need for a wall, but the neighbor needs the wall because he's actually using the farm to create wealth, or not even wealth, but to subsist. Do you see the difference? So the conflict comes in with the neighbor who is trying to subsist through his farm and the hipstery narrator who just thinks of farming as fun. So that would be an example of Marxist and social criticism. All right. So now we have another set, and then it says historical criticism and new historicism. But this basically, both are addressed in this video, okay? And so this is basically, and you can go through this video, it gives you more information about the difference between the two. But basically in terms of this course, just focus more on historical criticism. And what you would do is you're looking at a work through a historical lens, right? So you would either discuss how a work shaped history, but that's a little tricky. Most of the times you want to discuss how a work is part of history. All right, so let's go back to Mending Wall again. And how would we use historical criticism to interpret Mending Wall? This one is a little tricky. So you could, if you really wanted to, examine some of the history behind farming during the early 20th century. I'm really pulling here, but early 20th century, and see how that influenced the poem itself. Now, you would have to kind of like have a point to the discussion. So maybe the point of the discussion is how the neighbor is trying to hold on to the old ways of doing things, but with the newfound methods in farming techniques, this old way is changing, perhaps. And this could mean, if we're looking at a theme, this could mean also speaking to how technology has been changing our country during the early 20th century. I don't know. It would be something like that. So if you're going to use historical criticism, again, you put on that history lens and you examine a work in terms of how it is a byproduct of history and what that means for the country or the world or the human experience at large. All right. Okay, so now we've got psychological criticism. All right, now psychological criticism, and definitely look through here. Basically, you're using the lens of psychological theory. And you could think of various psychologists. A lot of people use Freud, but there are a number of different psychologists that you can use to examine a work. So, and it says here, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, but sometimes it can mean something else. And it's just the same way with psychological theory. You can read a work and it could be a basic interpretation or it could have a greater meaning. So let's go back to Mending Wall yet again. All right, so the narrator seems to really need to be friends with the neighbor. But the neighbor, he's an introvert. He doesn't need a friend. The narrator is an extrovert and really needs friends. And the deeper meaning or the deeper theme could be the clash between introverts and extroverts. Again, I don't know, that might be out in left field, but that would be a way of using the psychological lens to interpret a work. Finally, when we have two more, and this would be structuralism and deconstruction. All right, so basically, structuralism would be how the work fits into the typical structure of a poem, for example, or a short story or a novel. For example, the hero's journey or the becoming of a man or a woman, something like that, the rom-com, basically. So how that work fits into that structure. But then also deconstruction means perhaps the work is trying to align itself with the hero's journey or a rom-com, but it doesn't work. It unravels. So those are the basic two meanings. So I would say if you plan on using either one of these two, please make sure to view this video because it really does help you. Now let me see if I can take the structural lens with the poem. So basically what you would do is you would use mending wall and you would find how this work places in with possibly some of the other poems during the early 20th century and how it follows a similar theme or style. And so basically that's how you would handle this lens in terms of that particular poem. You could do a number of other things as well, but that would be just one example. All right, and I think that is it for the critical lenses. This week, you will be covering songs, and I want you to know that songs are poems, and oftentimes they're quite lyrical. And so let's go back and look at the assigned songs for this week. So you have a number of songs that you can choose from, and they're from a number of different genres. For example, you have Bob Dylan and Woody Guthrie. I feel like those are from a kind of folk music genre, and also Simon and Garfunkel are part of that genre as well. Then you have a number of different ones. You have Tupac, you have country, you have Nirvana, Johnny Cash. I mean, there are a number of different songs that you can choose from. The video is right here, but if you click on that, you'll see the actual lyrics pull up here. And so you just kind of take a look at the lyrics, right? So take a look at these lyrics and then figure out what the work means. Let's see, I'm going to go back. Let me go back to the critical lenses. So you're going to go through and you're going to give the basic interpretation of the work, the new critical interpretation. But then you're going to use three different lenses to interpret this work, three different critical lenses. So example, you could look at This Land Is Your Land in terms of biographical criticism, what from Guthrie's life led to him writing this work, or how this work gives some sort of insight into Woody Guthrie. This could also be examined in terms of history. That'd be pretty easy because you could say about like what was going on during the time period when this work was written. You could also use this in terms of Marxist criticism. What does it say about the class structure in the United States? So those are the three different critical lenses that you can use to interpret this work, as well as the typical what is going on in this work discussion. All right, so again, you have a number of different poems that you can choose from. Now let's look at this PowerPoint presentation. All right. So you're going to choose one of the songs that I mentioned earlier, and you will have 5 slides. The first one, like I mentioned, is just your basic interpretation of the poem. Then you're going to find 3 additional critical lenses that I just discussed to interpret that song. Okay, and so each critical lens will be discussed on the 3 different slides that follow the new criticism, the basic interpretation of the song. Then in your final slide, you're going to say which way of interpreting that song is best. All right? Now, with this, I still want you to use academic third person. So you do need to avoid you, your, I, me, we, us, and so on. However, I don't expect you to write this like an essay. I'm not expecting you to have an intro and thesis. I'm not expecting a conclusion other than you choosing which critical method is best. I also want you really to keep inside the 500 to 800 word range. And it is around 100 through 200 words per slide, but that's not an exact science. And then also, you do not need to use outside sources. But if you do, you need to include a citation list and let the reader know where you found your information. Okay? So this is due this Sunday. But if you have any questions, please post your questions in the open forum. I know your instructor will be more than happy to answer your questions for you. I wish you the best. I'm sure you're going to do well, but again, if you have any issues, please make sure to ask your instructor. Have a great day, everyone.